Heavenly Father, I pray for everyone watching this video right now. May you bless them with peace, joy, and breakthroughs in their lives. Amen. Hello, my wonderful family. I am so glad and grateful to have you here with me today. Your support means the world, and I truly don't take it for granted. Before we dive into today's powerful story, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, drop a comment below to share your thoughts, and of course, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update from this channel. I have something important to share with everyone tonight. The words cut through the wedding reception's warm chatter like a blade through silk. Margaret felt her champagne glass freeze halfway to her lips as her husband Richard stood up at the head table, tapping his knife against crystal with deliberate precision. No, she thought, her stomach dropping with the terrible intuition that comes from 28 years of marriage. Asterisk not here. Not tonight, asterisk. Richard, sit down, she whispered urgently, but her voice was lost in the expectant hush falling over their son James's wedding reception. 200 guests, family, friends, colleagues, all turning their attention toward the man Margaret had built her entire adult life around. Richard's smile was the one he used in board meetings when he was about to deliver devastating news to competitors. Margaret had seen it 1,000 times but never directed at her, never wielded like a weapon in front of everyone they knew. 28 years ago, I married a wonderful woman, Richard began, his voice carrying clearly across the elegant ballroom. Margaret felt a flutter of confused relief. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe this was just an awkward but heartfelt toast. Margaret has been the perfect wife, the perfect mother to our son James. She's been everything I thought I wanted. The past tense hit Margaret like ice water. Thought I wanted, has been. Every verb choice was a small death, and she could see in Richard's calculated expression that he knew exactly what he was doing. But I've realized something important about myself recently, Richard continued, his voice growing stronger as Margaret's world began to crumble. I've realized that settling for perfect means settling for a life without passion, without real love. Margaret's hand found James's arm beside her, gripping desperately as whispers began rippling through the tables. Her son's new wife, Emma, looked horrified. Margaret's sister Louise was half standing from her chair, her face a mask of disbelief. So tonight, Richard said, raising his glass with theatrical flourish, on this beautiful evening celebrating new love, I want to announce that I've found something I never thought I'd have again. Real love. Passionate love. The kind of love that makes you remember you're alive. Margaret felt the room spinning around her, felt 200 pairs of eyes burning into her skin. This couldn't be happening. Not at James's wedding. Not in front of their families, their friends, their entire community. Her name is Diane, Richard continued with the satisfied tone of a man delivering a perfectly timed business presentation. She's given me a reason to start over, to build a life based on authentic feelings instead of comfortable routines. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could feel her son's hand covering hers, could sense the collective shock of every person in the room processing what they'd just witnessed. So I'm proposing a toast, Richard said, his voice cutting through the stunned quiet. To new beginnings. To having the courage to choose happiness over habit. To love that doesn't settle for safe. He raised his glass higher, looking directly at Margaret for the first time since he'd begun speaking. Margaret, thank you for being exactly what I needed for the first half of my life. I hope you'll understand why I need something different for the second half. The champagne glass slipped from Margaret's numb fingers, shattering against her dinner plate with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. The crystal fragments scattered across the white tablecloth like her 28-year marriage, like her assumptions about the man she'd shared a bed with for nearly 3 decades. Dad, James's voice was barely controlled fury. What the hell are you doing? I'm being honest, Richard replied calmly, still standing, still holding his glass like he was waiting for someone to join his toast. Something I should have done years ago. Margaret found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. You planned this. You planned to do this here, tonight, in front of everyone. I planned to be honest at a moment that would make it impossible to ignore or sweep under the rug, Richard confirmed. Margaret, you've spent 28 years managing my image, controlling how things look to other people. I figured it was time for a little truth that couldn't be managed. The cruelty of it hit Margaret like a physical blow. He hadn't just fallen in love with someone else. He'd orchestrated this public humiliation as revenge for something she didn't even understand. Richard, Louise's voice carried clearly from across the room. You son of a bitch. Louise, please. Margaret said automatically, the decades-old habit of keeping peace, of managing family dynamics, of protecting Richard's reputation even as he destroyed hers. But Richard laughed, actually laughed at Louise's outburst. See, Margaret? That's exactly what I mean. Even now, you're more concerned about appearances than feelings. You're more worried about managing the situation than expressing genuine emotion. Margaret stared at this man she'd shared a life with, seeing him clearly for the first time in years. The calculated timing, the public venue, the theatrical presentation. This wasn't a moment of passionate honesty. This was psychological warfare disguised as enlightenment. Who is she? Margaret asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Someone who appreciates being chosen instead of settled for, Richard replied. Someone who makes me feel like the man I'm supposed to be instead of the man I'm expected to be. Emma, James's new bride, stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is sick, she said loudly enough for half the room to hear. This is our wedding, and you're destroying your wife in front of everyone we know. James, we need to do something. But Margaret was studying Richard's face, seeing something in his expression that didn't match his words. There was smugness there, satisfaction, but also something else, something that looked almost like fear. Richard, she said quietly, her mind suddenly racing through months of strange behaviors she'd dismissed. How long have you been planning this? Not the affair, this moment. This public announcement. Richard's confident smile flickered for just an instant. Margaret, I don't think this is the time for. Answer me. Margaret's voice was growing stronger, drawing power from some source she didn't recognize. How long have you been planning to humiliate me at our son's wedding? The question hung in the air, and Margaret saw Richard's hesitation, saw him glance toward the ballroom's entrance where a few guests were quietly slipping out, saw him calculate something she couldn't identify. Because, Margaret continued, rising to her feet with deliberate grace, if you've been planning this for months, then you've also been planning what comes next. The divorce papers, the asset division, the custody arrangements for appearances at family events. Richard's face went slightly pale. Margaret, let's discuss this privately. No. Margaret's voice was clear and carrying now, addressing not just Richard but the entire room of witnesses. You chose to make this public, so let's keep it public. Tell everyone how you've been preparing for this moment. Tell them about the bank accounts, the property transfers, the legal consultations. The silence was different now, not shocked but expectant. Margaret could feel the room's energy shifting, could sense that she'd touched on something Richard hadn't expected her to know. Tell them about Diane's qualifications, Margaret pressed. Tell them how long you've been moving assets. Tell them why you chose tonight specifically, why it had to be at James's wedding instead of any other time. Richard's confident demeanor was cracking, revealing something desperate underneath. Margaret, you're making assumptions. Am I? Margaret reached into her purse, pulling out her phone with movements that were perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. Should I call Diane right now? Ask her to join us? Since you're being so honest about new beginnings, maybe she'd like to meet your family. The threat landed exactly as Margaret intended. Richard's face went white, his glass finally lowering as he realized he'd miscalculated something fundamental about the woman he'd just tried to destroy. Margaret, don't. Don't what, Richard? Don't embarrass you the way you just embarrassed me? Don't make you look like something other than the noble truth-teller seeking authentic love. Margaret's finger hovered over her phone screen, and for the first time since he'd begun speaking, Richard looked genuinely afraid. What did you think would happen tonight? Margaret asked, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. What did you think I would do when you announced you were leaving me for another woman at our son's wedding? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it, apparently realizing he had no good answer. Because I know what I'm going to do, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm going to find out exactly who Diane is, exactly how long this has been going on, and exactly what you've been hiding from me while you plan this moment. She looked around the room at 200 faces watching her with expressions ranging from sympathy to fascination to outright admiration. And then, Margaret continued, I'm going to show everyone in this room exactly what 28 years of marriage to Richard Morrison has taught me about getting what I want. The promise hung in the air like a challenge. Richard was no longer smiling, no longer confident, no longer in control of the narrative he'd tried to create. And Margaret Morrison, who hadn't felt truly powerful in decades, suddenly realized she was just getting started. The ballroom erupted into chaos the moment Margaret finished speaking. Guests pushed back from tables, some heading for exits while others clustered together in urgent whispered conversations. Margaret stood perfectly still at the center of the storm, watching Richard struggle to regain control of a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond his expectations. "Mom," James appeared at her side, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "We're getting you out of here. Emma's already called the car." "No." Margaret's voice was steady, almost serene. "I'm not running away from this, James. Your father chose to make this public, so we're going to handle it publicly." Louise pushed through the crowd, her face blazing with protective fury. "Margaret, honey, what do you need? Should I call David?" David, Margaret's brother, the family lawyer who'd handled their wills, their business partnerships, their son's trust fund. Margaret felt a cold smile touch her lips as she realized Louise was thinking exactly what she was thinking. "Actually, yes. Call David. Tell him it's urgent." Margaret kept her eyes on Richard, who was now in heated conversation with his business partner, Frank Morrison. "Tell him I need to know everything about Richard's recent financial activities." "Margaret," Richard's voice cut across the growing din. "This is getting out of hand. Let's go home and discuss this rationally." "Rationally?" Margaret turned to face him fully, and something in her expression made several nearby guests step back. "Richard, you just announced to 200 people that you're leaving me for another woman. At our son's wedding. What part of that suggests you're interested in rational discussion?" Emma appeared at Margaret's other side, still in her wedding dress but with steel in her spine that reminded Margaret why she'd loved this girl from the moment James brought her home. "Mrs. Morrison, whatever you need, we're here. All of us." Margaret looked around at the faces supporting her, James, Emma, Louise, even some of Richard's colleagues who looked disgusted by what they'd witnessed. For the first time in decades, she wasn't alone in managing a crisis Richard had created. "What I need," Margaret said, loud enough for Richard to hear clearly, "is to understand exactly when my husband decided that destroying me publicly was more important than protecting our family's reputation." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. "Because Richard, I know you. I've managed your image for 28 years. You don't make moves this dramatic without extensive planning." Richard's business partner Frank approached cautiously. "Margaret, maybe we should all take a breath here. Emotions are running high." "Frank," Margaret interrupted, not looking up from her phone. "How long have you known about Diane?" The question hit Frank like a physical blow. Margaret watched him glance desperately at Richard, saw the answer in his panicked expression. "I thought so," Margaret said calmly. "Frank, you've been to our house for dinner twice a month for 15 years. You've watched James grow up. You were at his graduation, his engagement party. And you've known Richard was planning to humiliate me at my own son's wedding. Margaret, it's not that simple. Actually, it is that simple." Margaret's voice was gaining strength, drawing power from 28 years of suppressed anger. "It's about loyalty, Frank. It's about basic human decency. It's about whether you protect a family or participate in destroying it." She turned back to Richard, who was now looking genuinely alarmed. "Which brings me to my next question, Richard. If you've been planning this for months, and if Frank knew about it, who else has been part of your little conspiracy?" The word conspiracy seemed to hit Richard like a slap. "Margaret, you're being paranoid." "Am I?" Margaret held up her phone, showing a text conversation. "This is from your secretary, Linda. From 3 weeks ago. She's asking if I need help coordinating anything for James's wedding because she knows how stressful these events can be." Margaret's voice grew colder with each word. "Except Linda has never, in 8 years of working for you, sent me a personal text about anything. She barely acknowledges my existence when I call your office. But 3 weeks ago, she suddenly cared about my stress levels." Richard's face had gone ashen. "Margaret, Linda was just being thoughtful." "Linda was gathering intelligence," Margaret corrected. "Someone told her to find out how invested I was in making James's wedding perfect, how much it would devastate me if something went wrong." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Margaret could see the guests who'd remained processing what she was suggesting, that Richard hadn't just planned to leave her, but had orchestrated specifically to maximize her humiliation. "Mom," James's voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "What are you saying?" Margaret looked at her son, seeing Richard's stubborn chin and her own determined eyes, and realized she was about to shatter whatever remained of his relationship with his father. "I'm saying your father didn't just decide to leave me tonight, James. He's been planning this for months, coordinating with other people, timing it specifically for maximum impact." Margaret's voice softened with genuine pain. He chose your wedding because he knew I'd never make a scene that would ruin your special day. He was counting on me being too well-trained to fight back. That's enough, Richard said sharply. Margaret, you're making accusations you can't prove. Can I? Margaret pulled out a business card from her purse, one she'd been carrying for 3 weeks without understanding why. Richard, remember when you asked me to pick up your dry cleaning 2 weeks ago? The one on 5th Street instead of our usual place. Richard's face went white. The woman behind the counter was very chatty, Margaret continued. Kept asking about the wedding, about how excited I must be, about whether I was nervous about big changes coming. Strange questions from someone I'd never met, don't you think? Margaret looked around the room, seeing understanding dawn on several faces. Unless someone had told her to pump me for information. Unless someone wanted to know exactly how clueless I was about what my husband was planning. Jesus Christ, Louise breathed. Margaret, how long has this been going on? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Margaret replied. But I think it goes back further than any of us realized. She turned to face Richard directly, and something in her expression made him step backward. Richard, do you remember our anniversary dinner last month? When you seemed so distracted, so distant. When you kept checking your phone and apologizing, saying work was crazy. Margaret, don't. You took a call during dessert. Said it was an emergency client. But Richard, I've been married to you for 28 years. I know the difference between your work voice and your personal voice. Margaret's voice was growing stronger, more confident, as pieces clicked into place. That wasn't a work call. That was Diane, wasn't it? Calling during our anniversary dinner to discuss your exit strategy. The accuracy of her guess was written all over Richard's face. Several guests gasped audibly, and Margaret saw Frank actually take a step away from Richard, as if distancing himself from the level of calculated cruelty they were witnessing. And the business trip to Denver last month, Margaret continued relentlessly. The one where your phone died and you couldn't call for 2 days. Except your credit card showed charges at restaurants and hotels in Phoenix. Emma gripped James's arm, both of them staring at Margaret with growing amazement and horror. How long have you known? Richard asked quietly, his bravado finally cracking. I've suspected for 6 weeks, Margaret replied. But I've known for exactly 3 hours. The confession hit the room like a thunderclap. 3 hours? James asked. Margaret's smile was sharp as broken glass. Your father's phone buzzed during the ceremony. While we were watching you exchange vows with Emma, while I was crying with happiness about our son's future, Richard was getting a text from someone named D, saying, "Ready when you are." The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that even some of Richard's friends looked nauseated. So I excused myself during the photo session, Margaret continued, and I made some calls. Starting with David, then with our bank, then with that lovely private investigator your Uncle David recommended last year when the neighbors were having marriage problems. Richard's face had gone from white to gray. Margaret, what have you done? What have I done? Margaret's laugh was sharp and mirthless. Richard, what have you been doing? Because in the past 3 hours, I've learned some very interesting things about your recent activities. She pulled out a folder she'd retrieved from her car during the photo session. A folder that suddenly seemed far more important than wedding pictures. I've learned about the joint bank account you opened with Diane Patterson 3 months ago. I've learned about the condo you've been renting in her name. I've learned about the business partnership you established last week that conveniently removes me from any financial oversight of your investments. Each revelation hit Richard like a physical blow, but Margaret wasn't finished. But the most interesting thing I learned, Margaret said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent ballroom, is that Diane Patterson isn't just your girlfriend, Richard. She's your business partner's daughter. The words fell into absolute silence. Frank Morrison went pale as death, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. That's right, Margaret continued, looking directly at Frank. Diane Patterson Morrison, your 26-year-old daughter, who works for the accounting firm that handles Richard's business finances. The daughter who's had access to our personal financial information for months. The implications hit the room like a bomb. This wasn't just an affair. It was a coordinated attack on Margaret's financial security by people she'd trusted. Frank, Louise's voice was deadly quiet. Your daughter seduced Margaret's husband to steal their money? It's not like that, Frank said desperately. Diane and Richard, they genuinely care about each other. Diane and Richard have been systematically moving assets out of accounts I have access to, Margaret corrected. Assets that represent 28 years of building a life together. My inheritance from my parents, my portion of Richard's business, the college fund I contributed to, the retirement accounts I helped build. Margaret looked around the room at faces reflecting horror, disgust, and growing admiration for her detective work. So when Richard stands up tonight and talks about choosing authentic love over comfortable routine, Margaret said, her voice ringing with cold fury, what he's really announcing is that he and his business partner's daughter have been stealing from me for months while planning to humiliate me publicly as their grand finale. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Frank appeared to be having trouble breathing. Even some of the remaining guests were pulling out their phones, presumably to check their own financial arrangements with Richard's firm. Margaret, Richard said desperately, you don't understand the whole situation. I understand perfectly, Margaret replied. I understand that you're not just leaving me, Richard. You're trying to destroy me. Take my money, ruin my reputation, humiliate me in front of everyone I know, and leave me with nothing at 52 years old. She stepped closer to him, close enough that only he could hear her next words. But Richard, you made one crucial mistake in all your planning. What mistake? Margaret's smile was like winter sunlight, beautiful and deadly. You assumed that the woman who's been managing your life for 28 years, who's been protecting your reputation and cleaning up your messes and building your success, would be helpless without you. She raised her voice so the entire room could hear. You assumed I was just the perfect wife who happened to get lucky by marrying well. You forgot that I was also the daughter who saved her father's failing business, the woman who put her own career aside to build yours, the mother who raised a son while you traveled, and the partner who's actually been the brains behind half your success. The revelation was hitting Richard like a series of physical blows, but Margaret wasn't done. So here's what's going to happen, she said, pulling out her phone one more time. I'm going to make a call to Detective Williams, who's been very interested in the financial irregularities David discovered this afternoon. Then I'm going to make another call to the State Bar Association, since using your business position to defraud your wife probably violates several ethical guidelines. Margaret, you can't. And then, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, I'm going to make one final call. To Channel 7 News, who've been trying to reach me for comment about your firm's recent audit irregularities. Richard's face went from gray to green. What audit irregularities? Margaret's smile was triumphant. The ones that started 3 weeks ago when someone anonymously reported suspicious financial activity at Morrison & Associates. Someone who had access to internal documents and detailed knowledge of your business practices. The truth hit Richard like lightning. You reported us. I reported financial irregularities that I discovered while helping you prepare tax documents, Margaret corrected. Irregularities that suggest someone at your firm has been using client accounts for unauthorized purposes. She looked around the room at 200 witnesses to Richard's humiliation, at her son and daughter-in-law who were staring at her with newfound respect, at Louise who was grinning with fierce pride. So Richard, Margaret said, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, you wanted authenticity over comfort? You wanted passion over routine? You wanted a new beginning based on truth instead of appearances. She gestured toward the exit, where several police cars had just pulled up outside. Whether coincidentally or by design, Margaret couldn't tell. Congratulations, she said. You're about to get exactly what you asked for. The police cars outside turned out to be responding to a noise complaint from the hotel's neighboring businesses, but their arrival sent a ripple of panic through the remaining wedding guests. Margaret watched Richard's face cycle through relief, calculation, and growing desperation as he realized the evening was spiraling far beyond his control. Mom, James said urgently, gripping her arm. We need to talk. Now. Privately. Margaret looked at her son, seeing something in his expression that made her stomach clench. What is it? Emma's pregnant. The words hit Margaret like ice water. She looked at her daughter-in-law, seeing past the wedding makeup to the pale exhaustion underneath, the way Emma was holding herself carefully, the reason behind her repeated glances toward the exit. How far along? Margaret asked quietly. 8 weeks, Emma whispered. We were going to tell everyone after the honeymoon, but with everything that's happening, Margaret felt the weight of new responsibilities settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore, wasn't just about revenge against Richard's betrayal. Her actions tonight would determine what kind of family her grandchild grew up knowing. Richard, she called across the ballroom, her voice cutting through the murmured conversations. "We need to discuss this privately." "Now, Margaret, I think that's wise." "Not you," Margaret interrupted. "Just Richard. Family meeting. Everyone else can wait in the hotel bar." Louise stepped forward protectively. "Margaret, honey, are you sure you want to be alone with him right now?" Before Margaret could answer, a new voice cut through the tension. "She won't be alone." Everyone turned to see Detective Sarah Williams approaching through the ballroom's main entrance. Margaret felt her heart skip. She hadn't expected the police involvement to move this quickly. "Detective Williams," Margaret said carefully, "this is unexpected." "Mrs. Morrison, we received some interesting documents this afternoon. I think we need to discuss them." Detective Williams' eyes swept the room, taking in the wedding decorations, the scattered guests, the obvious tension. "Perhaps somewhere more private?" Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The financial irregularities she'd reported were supposed to be investigated quietly, over weeks or months. The detective's presence here tonight suggested something far more serious was happening. "Of course," Margaret said, maintaining her composure while her mind raced through possibilities. "Richard, it seems your authentic new beginning is starting sooner than expected." But Richard was staring at Detective Williams with an expression that confused Margaret. Not fear or guilt, but something that looked almost like recognition. "Detective," Richard said carefully, "I think there may be some misunderstanding here." "Mr. Morrison, I don't think there's any misunderstanding at all." Detective Williams pulled out a tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be financial documents. "We've been investigating irregularities at Morrison and Associates for 6 months. The anonymous tip we received 3 weeks ago simply accelerated our timeline." 6 months. Margaret felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "Detective, I only reported the irregularities 3 weeks ago." "Mrs. Morrison, you weren't our original source." Detective Williams looked at Margaret with something that might have been sympathy. "We've been building a case against your husband's firm since last fall. Your report simply provided additional confirmation of patterns we'd already identified." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her carefully orchestrated revenge, her moment of brilliant detective work, her discovery of Richard's betrayal, none of it was original. She'd been following a trail that others had blazed months earlier. Who was the original source? Margaret asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. Detective Williams glanced at Richard, then back at Margaret. "Mrs. Morrison, this conversation really should happen in private." "No," Margaret said firmly. "My son and daughter-in-law deserve to know what's happening to their family. Whatever you have to say it here." Detective Williams hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Very well. Mrs. Morrison, the original investigation was initiated by Diana Patterson." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret felt the world tilt sideways as she processed what the detective had just revealed. "Diane reported Richard?" James asked, his voice hollow with confusion. "Ms. Patterson came to us last October with evidence that Morrison and Associates was being used to launder money for several criminal organizations. She'd been gathering evidence for months, documenting financial irregularities and building a case." Margaret stared at Richard, seeing something new in his expression. Not guilt, but a kind of desperate sadness that recontextualized everything she thought she understood. "Richard," she said slowly, "what is Detective Williams talking about?" Richard looked around the ballroom at the faces staring at him, his son, his daughter-in-law, his wife, his business partner, and seemed to deflate. "Diane isn't my girlfriend," he said quietly. "She's an undercover federal investigator who's been building a case against Frank's money laundering operation for the past year." The admission hit the room like an explosion. Frank Morrison went white as paper, taking an involuntary step backward. Margaret felt her legs give out slightly, forcing her to grip the edge of the table for support. "She's what?" Louise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Diane Patterson is FBI," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. "She approached me 6 months ago with evidence that Frank had been using our firm to launder money for drug trafficking operations. She needed my cooperation to gather enough evidence for prosecution." Margaret felt 28 years of marriage recontextualizing in real time. The secret phone calls, the business trips, the new accounts, were all part of building the case against Frank, Richard confirmed. "Margaret, I couldn't tell you because the investigation required absolute secrecy. Frank suspected someone was gathering evidence, and if he'd known I was cooperating, he would have destroyed the evidence and disappeared," Detective Williams finished. Mr. Morrison has been helping us for months, documenting transactions and gathering intelligence. Margaret looked at Frank Morrison, this man who'd been to their house for dinner hundreds of times, who'd watched James grow up, who'd been Richard's trusted partner for 15 years. Frank, is this true? Frank's expression had shifted from panic to cold calculation. Richard, you naive fool. Do you have any idea what you've done? The admission was like a confession. Margaret saw James step protectively closer to Emma, saw Louise reach for her phone, saw Detective Williams' hand move toward her radio. Frank, Richard said sadly, I know exactly what I've done. I've stopped a criminal operation that was destroying innocent people's lives. You've destroyed our partnership. You've destroyed everything we built together. We built it on blood money. Richard's voice carried across the ballroom with surprising force. Frank, I've seen the evidence. I know where that money came from. I know what it funded. Margaret felt pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Richard, that's why you couldn't tell me. Not because you were having an affair, but because you were trying to protect me from knowing that our life was built on criminal money. Our life wasn't built on criminal money, Richard said firmly. But Frank was using our firm's legitimate operations to hide his illegal ones. Margaret, when I found out what he was doing, when I realized how he'd compromised everything we'd worked for. You decided to do something about it instead of walking away, Margaret finished. I decided to help the FBI build a case that would put him in prison and recover money for the people he'd stolen from. Detective Williams stepped forward. Mrs. Morrison, your husband has been instrumental in uncovering a money laundering operation that spans 3 states and involves over $40 million in drug money. Margaret looked at Richard, seeing him clearly for the first time in months. The distance, the secrecy, the strange behavior, it hadn't been betrayal. It had been the strain of living a double life to expose a criminal. But tonight, Margaret said slowly, the announcement about Diane, about leaving me, was Frank's idea, Richard said miserably. He suspected I was cooperating with investigators. He told me if I didn't create a believable distraction, something that would dominate everyone's attention and make them stop asking questions about my recent behavior, he'd disappear and take evidence with him that would implicate me in his crimes. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming. Margaret realized that Richard had sacrificed his reputation, his marriage, and his relationship with his son to protect her from a criminal investigation while ensuring Frank couldn't escape justice. So you let me think you were betraying me, Margaret said, to prevent Frank from realizing you were betraying him. I let you think I was a selfish bastard having a midlife crisis instead of a man whose business partner was threatening to destroy our family if I didn't provide cover for his crimes. Margaret felt tears starting, but she couldn't tell if they were from relief, anger, or overwhelming confusion. Richard, you could have trusted me. We could have figured this out together. Margaret, Frank has connections to people who kill witnesses and their families. I couldn't risk your safety or James's safety by involving you in something that dangerous. Frank laughed bitterly. Richard, you sentimental fool. Do you think cooperation with the FBI is going to protect your family? Do you think my associates are going to care about the distinction between willing and unwilling participants? The threat was clear and immediate. Detective Williams was already radioing for backup while scanning the ballroom for potential threats. Frank, she said sharply, you're under arrest for money laundering, racketeering, and threatening federal witnesses. But Frank was moving toward the ballroom service entrance, his hand reaching inside his jacket. Detective, I don't think you understand the situation here. Don't, Richard said urgently, stepping between Frank and Margaret. Frank, whatever you're thinking, these people are innocent. Take me if you need leverage, but leave my family alone. Margaret watched this confrontation unfold, realizing that her evening of revenge had transformed into a life-or-death situation none of them had anticipated. The man she'd thought was betraying her was actually trying to protect her from a criminal who'd infiltrated their lives for over a decade. Nobody's going anywhere, Detective Williams said, drawing her weapon with practiced efficiency. Mr. Morrison, step away from your family. Mr. Patterson, hands where I can see them. But Frank was smiling now, a cold expression that made Margaret's blood freeze. Detective, I think you'll find that the evidence you've been building depends entirely on witnesses who might not survive to testify. The threat hung in the air like poison. Margaret realized that her quest for truth and justice had exposed her entire family to dangers she'd never imagined. James, she said urgently, get Emma out of here. Now. I'm not leaving you, James said firmly. You're not staying to watch your pregnant wife get caught in a shootout, Margaret replied with steel in her voice. Go, both of you. Let the professionals handle this. But as Margaret spoke, she was moving too, not away from the danger but toward it. Because 28 years of marriage had taught her that sometimes protecting the people you love means putting yourself between them and the threat. And Richard Morrison, whatever his flaws, whatever his mistakes in handling this situation, was still the father of her son and the man who'd risked everything to do the right thing. Even if it meant letting her believe he was destroying their marriage to hide the fact that he was trying to save their lives. Detective Williams, Margaret said clearly, what do you need us to do? I need you to trust that we can handle this situation, Detective Williams replied, her weapon trained on Frank while more officers flooded into the ballroom. But Margaret was looking at Richard, seeing something in his expression that suggested the situation was more complicated than even Detective Williams understood. Richard, Margaret said quietly, what aren't you telling us? Richard's face was pale with fear and resignation. Margaret, Frank isn't just a money launderer. He's connected to people who've been watching our family for months. And tonight's public spectacle has just painted a target on all of us that's not going to disappear when he gets arrested. The revelation hit Margaret like ice water. Her marriage wasn't just complicated, it was lethal. And her grandchild was going to be born into a world where the sins of their grandfather's business partner could follow them for years. The question now wasn't whether she could forgive Richard for his deception. It was whether any of them would survive long enough for forgiveness to matter. The hotel ballroom had transformed into something resembling a crime scene. Police officers positioned themselves at every exit while Detective Williams coordinated with federal agents who'd apparently been monitoring the situation from nearby locations. Margaret found herself in the surreal position of being both a victim and a key witness in an investigation she'd unknowingly triggered. Mrs. Morrison, we need to move your family to a secure location, Agent Martinez said, appearing beside Detective Williams with the efficient authority of someone accustomed to life-threatening situations. Our intelligence suggests that Mr. Patterson's associates may already be aware of tonight's events. Margaret looked around the ballroom, seeing her son's wedding reception transformed into a federal crime scene, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. How many associates? At least 6 individuals with connections to drug trafficking organizations. They've been using Morrison and Associates to launder money for over 18 months. Agent Martinez's expression was grim. Mrs. Morrison, your husband's cooperation has been invaluable, but it's also made your family a target. Richard appeared at Margaret's side, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. Margaret, I know you have questions, but right now we need to focus on keeping everyone safe. Everyone safe, Margaret repeated, looking at her son and daughter-in-law who were being escorted toward a side exit by federal agents. Richard, exactly how much danger are we in? Enough that we can't go home tonight, Richard said quietly. Enough that James and Emma need protection. Enough that this investigation has probably just ended life as we know it. The weight of what Richard was telling her settled over Margaret like a shroud. What do you mean life as we know it? Agent Martinez answered before Richard could respond. Mrs. Morrison, your husband has been gathering evidence that will likely result in prosecutions across multiple states. The criminal organization involved has a history of eliminating witnesses and their families. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. You're talking about witness protection. We're talking about ensuring your family survives the next few months while we dismantle this operation, Agent Martinez corrected. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to understand something. Your husband volunteered for this investigation knowing it would put his family at risk. But he also knew that doing nothing would eventually put you at even greater risk. Margaret looked at Richard, seeing him through a lens that was still adjusting to new information. What does that mean? It means Frank was escalating, Richard said, his voice heavy with guilt and fear. Margaret, the money laundering operation was expanding. Frank was bringing in new partners, moving larger amounts of money, involving more dangerous people. Eventually, they would have needed more control over the business, which meant removing me or compromising me in ways that would have destroyed our family anyway. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming. Margaret realized that Richard hadn't just been protecting her from immediate danger. He'd been trying to prevent their family from being slowly consumed by a criminal operation. So you chose to blow it up instead of letting it slowly destroy us, Margaret said. I chose to work with people who could stop it permanently instead of hoping it would go away on its own. Agent Martinez's radio crackled with urgent communication. She listened intently, then turned back to Margaret and Richard with an expression that made Margaret's stomach clench. "We have a problem," Agent Martinez said. "Surveillance indicates that at least 3 vehicles have been monitoring this hotel for the past hour. They're not law enforcement." The implication was clear. Frank's associates were already moving to protect their interests. "James and Emma?" Margaret asked immediately. "Are being moved to a federal safe house as we speak," Agent Martinez assured her. "But Mrs. Morrison, we need to discuss your options." "What options?" "You and your husband can enter witness protection immediately. New identities, relocation, complete separation from your current life until the prosecutions are complete and the threats are neutralized." Margaret felt the walls of her world closing in. "What about our son? Our grandchild? Would be protected separately until it's safe for the family to reunite." The thought of being separated from James and Emma during the pregnancy, of missing her grandchild's birth, of abandoning the life she'd built over nearly 3 decades hit Margaret like a physical blow. "How long?" she asked. "Potentially years," Agent Martinez said honestly. "Mrs. Morrison, this isn't a temporary inconvenience. This is a complete restructuring of your life to ensure your survival." Margaret looked at Richard, seeing something in his expression that suggested there were still more revelations coming. "Richard, what else haven't you told me?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, glancing at Agent Martinez as if seeking permission to continue. "Margaret, the investigation has uncovered more than just Frank's money laundering operation." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've discovered that our business, our social circle, our entire community has been infiltrated by this criminal organization in ways we never imagined." Agent Martinez pulled out her tablet, showing Margaret a complex chart that looked like a spider web of connections. Mrs. Morrison and Associates wasn't the only legitimate business being used as a front. "We've identified at least 12 other companies, 3 charitable organizations, and 2 social clubs that have been compromised." Margaret studied the chart, recognizing names and organizations she'd been involved with for years. "The Country Club has been used to facilitate meetings between criminals and corrupt officials," Agent Martinez confirmed. "The Children's Hospital Fundraising Committee has been moving drug money disguised as charitable contributions." Each revelation hit Margaret like a hammer blow. Every aspect of her social life, every organization she'd volunteered with, every relationship she'd built over decades, all of it potentially tainted by criminal activity she'd been blind to. "Richard," she said slowly, "how long have you suspected this?" "I've suspected something was wrong for 2 years," Richard admitted. "But I didn't understand the scope until Diane showed me the evidence." 2 years. Margaret felt something cold and angry building in her chest. "Richard, you've known for 2 years that our entire life was built on criminal money, and you said nothing?" "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what, and I didn't know how to investigate without putting you in danger. So you decided to handle it alone." "I decided to be careful until I understood what we were dealing with." Margaret realized that her anger wasn't just about Richard's secrecy. It was about her own blindness, her own willingness to accept a comfortable life without questioning its foundations. "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Martinez interrupted, "we really need to move you to a secure location. This discussion can continue once you're safe." But Margaret was studying the chart on the tablet, seeing connections that the federal agents might have missed. "Agent Martinez, what about Louise?" "Your sister?" "My sister who works for the accounting firm that handles the country club's finances. My sister who's been asking questions about unusual transactions for months." Agent Martinez and Richard exchanged a look that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Martinez said carefully, "we've been concerned about your sister's safety as well." "Concerned how?" "Louise Morrison has been asking questions that suggest she's identified some of the same irregularities your husband reported. Questions that may have attracted unwanted attention." Margaret felt panic rise in her throat. "Where is Louise now?" "We're not sure," Agent Martinez admitted. "She left the hotel approximately 30 minutes ago, saying she was going to make some phone calls. We haven't been able to reach her since." The words hit Margaret like lightning. While she'd been focused on her own drama, her own betrayal and revenge, her sister had been walking into danger that Margaret's actions might have accelerated. "Find her," Margaret said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "Agent Martinez, I don't care about witness protection or safe houses or any of it until I know my sister is safe." Mrs. Morrison, we have people looking. You have people looking for someone who may already be dead because I was too busy playing detective to warn her about the danger. Margaret's voice was growing stronger, drawing power from fear and guilt and 28 years of protecting the people she loved. Richard, call Louise. Now. Richard was already dialing, his face pale with worry. The call went straight to voicemail. Margaret, he said. Her phone is off. Agent Martinez was speaking rapidly into her radio, coordinating what sounded like a citywide search. But Margaret was thinking about her sister, about Louise's protective instincts, about the way she'd reacted to Richard's announcement. Agent Martinez, Margaret said suddenly. Louise didn't leave to make phone calls. She left to confront someone. What do you mean? My sister has been asking questions about financial irregularities for months. Tonight she heard Richard confess to cooperating with the FBI to expose criminal activity. Louise didn't leave to call for help. She left to warn someone she thinks might be in danger. The implication hit the room like a bomb. If Louise was trying to protect someone who was actually part of the criminal organization, she was walking into a trap. Who would she warn? Agent Martinez asked urgently. Margaret felt pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. David. She went to warn David. Your brother, the lawyer? My brother who handles legal affairs for half the organizations on your chart. My brother who's been Louise's contact for financial questions. My brother who probably knows more about the scope of this criminal operation than anyone except Frank. Margaret looked at Richard, seeing her own terrible understanding reflected in his eyes. Richard, David isn't just connected to this. David's been coordinating it. The revelation hit Agent Martinez like lightning. She was already coordinating with her team, already redirecting resources, already understanding that the investigation had just exposed a much larger problem. Mrs. Morrison, she said urgently, if your sister went to warn your brother, and if your brother is coordinating criminal activity, then Louise is walking into a situation where she's either going to be killed as a witness or used as leverage against us, Margaret finished. Margaret felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. Save herself and Richard through witness protection while Louise faced unknown danger. Try to save Louise while exposing her family to greater risk. Trust the federal agents to handle a situation that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Agent Martinez, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Of course. If we go into witness protection tonight, if we disappear into federal custody while you search for Louise, what are the odds she survives whatever David has planned for her? Agent Martinez was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Morrison, I can't give you odds on something like that. Then give me options. Because I'm not abandoning my sister to save myself, and I'm not letting my pregnant daughter-in-law get caught in crossfire because I refused federal protection. Margaret looked around the ballroom that had hosted her son's wedding just hours earlier, seeing federal agents and police officers and the remnants of what was supposed to be a celebration. Richard, she said quietly, we need to make a choice. Family or safety. We can't have both. Richard moved closer to her, and for the first time since his devastating announcement, Margaret felt like they were truly partners again. Margaret, he said softly, what do you want to do? Margaret thought about her sister, alone and in danger. She thought about her son and daughter-in-law, starting their marriage under federal protection. She thought about the grandchild who would be born into a world shaped by choices made tonight. I want to save Louise, she said, even if it means risking everything else. Then we save Louise, Richard said without hesitation. Agent Martinez looked at them both with something that might have been admiration. Mrs. Morrison, if you're determined to pursue this course of action, you need to understand that you'll be walking into extreme danger with no guarantee of success. Agent Martinez, Margaret replied, I've been walking into extreme danger without knowing it for years. At least this time, I'll be doing it with my eyes open. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret could see in Agent Martinez's expression that there were still more revelations coming. Still more complications that would test her resolve and her marriage and her family in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The question now wasn't whether she and Richard could work together to save Louise. It was whether any of them would survive what they discovered when they found her. Agent Martinez's radio crackled with an update that made everyone in the ballroom freeze. Unit 7 reporting. We've located Louise Morrison. She's at the downtown law offices of Morrison Legal Associates with David Morrison and 2 unidentified individuals. Margaret felt relief flood through her chest. She's safe. Thank God she's safe. But Agent Martinez's expression remained grim. Mrs. Morrison, there's more. Surveillance indicates this appears to be a planned meeting, not a hostage situation. Your sister arrived voluntarily and doesn't appear to be under duress. The words hit Margaret like cold water. What does that mean exactly? It means Louise Morrison may not be the innocent victim we assumed she was. Richard moved closer to Margaret, his face pale with understanding. Margaret, think about it. Louise has been asking financial questions for months. She works for the accounting firm that handles multiple compromised organizations. She left tonight immediately after hearing about the FBI investigation. She left to warn David because she was worried about him, Margaret said, but even as she spoke the words, she could hear doubt creeping into her voice. Agent Martinez pulled out her tablet, showing Margaret a series of financial documents. Mrs. Morrison, these are wire transfers from your sister's personal accounts over the past 18 months. Transfers that coincide with known money laundering activities at Morrison and Associates. Margaret stared at the numbers, seeing patterns that made her stomach clench with growing horror. You're saying Louise has been receiving money from Frank's operation? We're saying Louise Morrison has received over $200,000 in unexplained deposits over the past year and a half. Money that appears to have been payment for services rendered to the criminal organization. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped Richard's arm for support, feeling the last pillar of her support system crumble beneath her. That's impossible, Margaret whispered. Louise has been protecting me. She's been asking questions, investigating irregularities, trying to help me understand what was happening. Mrs. Morrison, Agent Martinez said gently, what if Louise wasn't investigating irregularities to expose them? What if she was investigating to make sure they stayed hidden? The words recontextualized every conversation Margaret had had with her sister over the past months. Louise's careful questions about Richard's behavior. Her insistence that Margaret deserved better. Her immediate rush to Margaret's defense tonight. She was gathering intelligence, Margaret said slowly. Louise wasn't protecting me from Richard's betrayal. She was monitoring me to make sure I didn't discover the real betrayal. Richard's face was grim with understanding. Margaret, think about tonight. Louise was the one who suggested calling David when you discovered Richard's affair. She was the one who encouraged you to investigate Richard's financial activities. She was directing my investigation away from the real criminals and toward the one person who was trying to stop them, Margaret finished, feeling sick with the implications. Agent Martinez's radio crackled again. Unit 7 has eyes on the law office. For individuals in the conference room. Appears to be a strategy meeting, not a rescue situation. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she realized the scope of her sister's deception. Agent Martinez, how long have you suspected Louise? We've been monitoring her communications for 6 weeks. Mrs. Morrison, your sister has been coordinating with your brother to ensure that your husband's cooperation with our investigation didn't compromise their operation. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Margaret felt physically ill. Her sister, the person she'd trusted most, the person who'd supported her through every crisis, the person she'd called when she needed help understanding Richard's behavior, had been working against her for over a year. What was she supposed to do tonight? Margaret asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Based on intercepted communications, Louise Morrison was supposed to ensure that you and your husband didn't survive the evening, Agent Martinez said quietly. The public nature of tonight's confrontation was meant to provide cover for what would appear to be a murder-suicide situation. Margaret felt Richard's arm tighten around her as the full horror of what they'd escaped became clear. They were going to kill us tonight? The plan appears to have been for you to discover Richard's affair, become distraught, and shoot him before turning the gun on yourself. Louise's role was to ensure you had access to Richard's gun and enough emotional motivation to use it. Margaret remembered Louise's concerned questions throughout the evening, her careful positioning near Margaret during the most emotional moments, her insistence that Margaret shouldn't let Richard's betrayal go unanswered. She was manipulating me toward violence, Margaret said, her voice hollow with shock. Louise was trying to turn me into a murderer. More specifically, she was trying to turn you into the perfect solution to several problems, Agent Martinez corrected. Your deaths would eliminate the key witnesses to Frank's money laundering operation while providing a tragic but believable explanation for your disappearance. Richard was studying the financial documents on Agent Martinez's tablet. Margaret, look at the timing of these payments to Louise. They started right after I first contacted the FBI about irregularities I'd noticed. Margaret saw the pattern immediately. She's been reporting on your cooperation from the beginning. Which means every strategy session, every piece of evidence we discussed, every plan we made, all of it was compromised because I was sharing information with you, and you were sharing information with Louise. The implications were staggering. Margaret realized that her marriage hadn't just been threatened by Richard's secrecy. It had been actively sabotaged by her sister's manipulation. Agent Martinez, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with anger. What exactly is happening at David's office right now? Based on surveillance, they appear to be coordinating an emergency response to tonight's events. Your brother, your sister, and 2 individuals we believe to be enforcers for the criminal organization. Margaret felt something cold and determined settling in her chest. They're planning to clean up loose ends. That would be our assessment. Which means they're planning to eliminate anyone who could connect them to Frank's operation. Agent Martinez nodded grimly. Mrs. Morrison, we believe your family was just the beginning. There are potentially dozens of witnesses and family members who represent ongoing threats to this organization. Margaret thought about James and Emma, about her grandchild who would grow up in a world shaped by the choices made tonight. She thought about other families who might be facing the same threats, the same betrayals, the same impossible choices. Agent Martinez, she said, her voice carrying a determination that surprised everyone, including herself. I want to help you stop them. Mrs. Morrison, that's not advisable. You're emotionally compromised, you're not trained for this kind of operation, and I'm the one person who knows Louise well enough to predict her behavior, Margaret interrupted. I'm the one person who understands her motivations, her weaknesses, her blind spots. Richard moved closer to Margaret. Margaret, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that Louise spent tonight manipulating me toward violence because she believes she understands me better than I understand myself. I'm thinking she's wrong about that. Margaret looked around the ballroom, seeing federal agents and police officers, seeing the remnants of her son's wedding reception, seeing the ruins of a life built on secrets and betrayal. Agent Martinez, Louise is expecting me to be devastated by Richard's betrayal. She's expecting me to be isolated, vulnerable, and desperate for someone to blame. And what if we gave her exactly what she's expecting? What if I contacted Louise, told her I'd escaped federal custody, told her I needed help dealing with Richard's cooperation with the FBI? The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Agent Martinez was studying Margaret with new respect. Mrs. Morrison, you're talking about walking into extreme danger with people who've already planned to kill you once tonight. I'm talking about using their expectations against them, Margaret corrected. Louise thinks she knows me. She thinks she can predict my reactions, control my responses, manipulate my emotions. But Agent Martinez, she's never seen me when I'm truly angry. Richard was looking at Margaret with something that might have been awe. Margaret, you're talking about confronting your sister while she's with armed criminals. I'm talking about ending this before it spreads to other families, before James and Emma spend their entire marriage in witness protection, before our grandchild grows up afraid of shadows. Margaret pulled out her phone, looking at Louise's number with new understanding. Agent Martinez, if I called Louise right now, told her I was desperate and needed help, what do you think she'd do? Based on her psychological profile, she'd probably suggest meeting somewhere private where she could assess your emotional state and determine how to handle you. Somewhere like David's office? Potentially. Margaret felt pieces of a plan clicking into place. Then let's give her that opportunity. Let's let Louise think she's manipulating me one more time. Agent Martinez was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of Margaret's proposal. Mrs. Morrison, if we pursue this course of action, you need to understand that you'll be walking into a situation where your sister, your brother, and armed criminals will all have reasons to want you dead. Agent Martinez, Margaret replied, I've been walking into that situation for over a year without knowing it. At least this time I'll have backup. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret could see something in Agent Martinez's expression that suggested there were still more revelations coming, still more betrayals that would test her resolve. Mrs. Morrison, there's one more thing you need to know before you make this decision. What? Agent Martinez hesitated, then seemed to decide that complete honesty was the only option. The criminal organization your family has been involved with, it's not just local. We believe Louise and David have been coordinating with similar operations, in at least 5 other cities. What does that mean? It means that if we don't stop them tonight, if they escape or if this operation is compromised, they'll disappear into a network that spans multiple states and involves hundreds of people. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her family anymore, wasn't just about her marriage or her sister's betrayal. This was about stopping a criminal organization that was destroying families across the country. "Richard," she said quietly, "are you with me?" Richard looked at his wife, the woman he'd deceived to protect, the woman who'd been betrayed by her closest family member, the woman who was now proposing to walk into mortal danger to stop a criminal conspiracy. "Margaret Morrison," he said softly, "I've been with you for 28 years. I'm not stopping now." Margaret felt something fundamental shift between them. Not just forgiveness, but a partnership deeper than anything they'd shared before. They weren't just husband and wife anymore. They were allies in a fight that would determine not just their survival, but the safety of their children and grandchildren. "Agent Martinez," Margaret said, "how do we do this?" But as Agent Martinez began outlining the tactical requirements for what Margaret was proposing, Margaret realized that the woman she'd been at the beginning of the evening, the comfortable wife, the trusting sister, the woman who managed problems rather than solving them, no longer existed. The woman who would face Louise and David and armed criminals tonight was someone new, someone forged by betrayal and tempered by necessity. Someone who'd finally learned the difference between managing a crisis and ending one. The question now was whether that would be enough to save the people she loved, or whether it would simply get them all killed more efficiently. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, until it started falling apart. Margaret sat in Agent Martinez's surveillance van 3 blocks from David's law office. Listening to the wire she was wearing transmit her increasingly frantic heartbeat to the federal agents monitoring her every word. The plan required her to call Louise, claim she'd escaped federal custody, and arrange a meeting that would allow agents to gather evidence and arrest everyone involved. What the plan hadn't accounted for was Louise's response. "Margaret, thank God you called." Louise's voice came through Margaret's phone with perfect maternal concern. "Are you safe? Where are you?" I'm scared, Louise. The FBI, they're saying terrible things about Richard, about our business. I don't know who to trust anymore." "Of course you're scared, honey. Listen to me, don't trust anyone in law enforcement right now. David and I have been investigating this situation, and we think Richard may have been set up." Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. Louise was supposed to suggest meeting at David's office. Instead, she was feeding Margaret information that suggested a completely different scenario. "Set up how?" Margaret asked, following the script Agent Martinez had prepared. "Margaret, we think the FBI agent working with Richard isn't legitimate. We think someone has been impersonating federal law enforcement to gather information about our family's finances." Agent Martinez was gesturing frantically, indicating that Margaret should continue following the planned conversation. But Margaret could hear something in Louise's voice that made her blood run cold. Not manipulation, but genuine panic. "Louise, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that Agent Martinez doesn't exist in any federal database. I'm talking about the fact that the investigation Richard thinks he's been cooperating with appears to be completely fabricated." The words hit the surveillance van like a bomb. Agent Martinez was typing rapidly on her computer, her face pale with something that looked like terror. "Margaret," Louise continued urgently, "where are you right now? I need to know you're somewhere safe." Margaret looked at Agent Martinez, seeing her own growing horror reflected in the agent's expression. "Louise, I'm with the people Richard was working with." "Margaret, get away from them. Now. Those people aren't FBI, they're the criminals Richard was trying to expose." The revelation hit Margaret like lightning. She looked around the surveillance van at the people she'd been trusting with her life, seeing them with new eyes. Agent Martinez was no longer typing. She was reaching for something hidden beneath her jacket. "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Martinez said, her voice suddenly different, colder. "I think this conversation has gone on long enough." Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that she was trapped in a vehicle with people who'd been playing a role, manipulating her just as thoroughly as Louise had been manipulating her for months. "You're not FBI," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the terror flooding her system. "We're contractors," Agent Martinez corrected, producing a weapon that was definitely not standard law enforcement issue. "Very expensive contractors hired to ensure that certain information never reaches actual federal authorities." Margaret's mind raced through everything that had happened since the police arrived at the hotel. The convenient timing, the extensive knowledge of her family's situation, the willingness to let her pursue a dangerous plan. "Richard," she said into her phone, knowing Louise was still listening. "They have Richard." "Margaret, listen to me very carefully." Louise's voice was sharp with urgency. "The real FBI has been trying to reach you for hours. Agent Williams, the real Agent Williams, has been looking for you since someone reported that federal agents had taken you from the hotel. But Detective Williams was at the hotel." "Detective Williams is in the hospital," Louise interrupted. "Someone attacked her 3 hours ago. Margaret, whoever has you, they're not law enforcement." Margaret felt the world tilt as she realized how completely she'd been deceived. The federal agents who'd taken her family to safety, the elaborate investigation, the sophisticated surveillance equipment, all of it had been an elaborate facade designed to isolate her from actual help. "Where's James?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "James and Emma are safe," Louise said quickly. "They're with David and the real FBI agents who've been trying to find you." "Margaret, where are you?" Agent Martinez, or whoever she really was, smiled with cold satisfaction. "Mrs. Morrison, your sister has been very helpful in locating you. But I'm afraid this reunion is going to be brief." Margaret realized with growing horror that Louise's phone call hadn't been an accident. The criminals holding her had been using her own sister to track her location. "Louise," Margaret said desperately, "they're using you to find me." "No, Margaret, I'm using them to find you." Louise's voice carried a determination Margaret had never heard before. "Honey, I need you to stay on this line and keep them talking. Help is coming." The vehicle was moving now, accelerating through city streets toward a destination Margaret couldn't see. Through the tinted windows, she could see police cars in the distance, but they weren't approaching. They were being systematically avoided by whoever was driving. "Mrs. Morrison," the fake Agent Martinez said, "your family has caused considerable disruption to our operations. You've cost us time, money, and several valuable partnerships." "Our operations? Did you really think Frank Morrison was operating alone? Did you think a small-time money launderer could coordinate activities across multiple states without substantial backing?" Margaret felt sick as she realized the scope of what she'd stumbled into. "How big is this?" "Big enough that your husband's cooperation with actual federal authorities would have exposed operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Big enough that eliminating a few witnesses is considered a reasonable business expense." The vehicle was slowing now, pulling into what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse district. Margaret could see other vehicles converging on their location. Not rescue vehicles, but additional threats. "Louise," Margaret said into her phone, "I love you. Tell James the first love him. Tell him to protect Emma and the baby. Margaret, don't you dare give up. Do you hear me? Don't you dare give up." But Margaret could see armed figures emerging from the other vehicles, could see the fake Agent Martinez preparing equipment that was definitely not designed for surveillance. "Louise, I need you to know something," Margaret said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I forgive you. For everything. I know you were trying to protect me. Margaret, you don't need to forgive me for anything. I've been trying to save you. I know. I finally understand that you've been fighting the same fight I thought I was fighting." The vehicle stopped. Margaret could hear footsteps approaching, could see the fake Agent Martinez checking her weapon with professional efficiency. "Mrs. Morrison," the fake agent said, "before we proceed, I need you to understand something. Your husband is already dead." The words hit Margaret like ice water, but she found she didn't believe them. "No, he's not. I'm sorry. Richard Morrison is many things, but he's not stupid. He figured out who you really were long before I did." Margaret felt something fierce and protective rising in her chest. "Richard's been married to me for 28 years. He knows what actual law enforcement looks like, and he knows what criminals pretending to be law enforcement look like." The fake Agent Martinez hesitated, apparently not expecting resistance. "Mrs. Morrison, I think you're overestimating your husband's capabilities. I think you're underestimating what 28 years of marriage teaches you about the person you love." Margaret looked directly at her captor. "Richard knew you weren't FBI the moment you walked into that ballroom. Everything he's done tonight has been designed to protect our family while gathering evidence against the real criminals." Margaret pulled out a small device she'd been palming since entering the vehicle. Not a tracking device, but a recording device Richard had slipped her during their last embrace. "Mrs. Morrison, what is that?" That's 20 minutes of recorded conversation with someone impersonating a federal agent while threatening to murder American citizens. Margaret's smile was sharp as broken glass. Richard may not be FBI, but he's been married to a woman who spent 15 years managing crisis communications for major corporations. I know how to gather evidence. The sound of sirens was growing closer, but they weren't the distant wail Margaret had been hearing all evening. These were close, immediate, and multiplying rapidly. You see, Margaret continued, Louise wasn't the only person I called tonight. While you were busy congratulating yourself on your elaborate deception, I was also texting every contact in my phone with your license plate number and location updates. The fake agent Martinez was reaching for her radio, but Margaret wasn't finished. I texted James, who contacted real FBI agents. I texted my neighbor, who contacted local police. I texted my book club, who contacted the media. Margaret's voice was growing stronger with each revelation. I even texted my hairdresser, who contacted everyone she knows because she loves a good story. The sound of vehicles surrounding the warehouse was unmistakable now. Real law enforcement, real media, real witnesses to whatever was about to happen. You made one crucial mistake, Margaret said as armed figures appeared at every window of the warehouse. You assumed that a woman who'd spent 28 years protecting her family's reputation wouldn't know how to destroy someone else's operation when she put her mind to it. But as the real FBI agents began shouting commands and the fake agent Martinez raised her weapon with desperate fury, Margaret realized that victory might still come at a price she wasn't prepared to pay. Because somewhere in the chaos of tactical teams and criminal arrests and media attention, Richard was facing his own life-or-death situation with people who had nothing left to lose. Louise, Margaret said into her phone as the world exploded into action around her. Find Richard. Whatever it takes, find Richard. Margaret, I already have. The words came through her phone with such relief that Margaret felt her knees give out. He's safe. He's safe. David's safe. Even Frank is safe, though he's in federal custody for money laundering. Margaret felt 28 years of marriage, 2 hours of thinking her husband was dead, and 1 evening of discovering that love was stronger than any deception settling into her bones. Louise, she said as federal agents took control of the situation around her, when this is over, we need to have a very long conversation about what family actually means. Margaret, Louise replied, I've been looking forward to that conversation for over a year. But as Margaret was led to safety, as the real federal agents processed the scene, as the media recorded her survival and the arrest of the criminals who'd targeted her family, she realized that the most important conversation wasn't going to be with Louise. It was going to be with Richard, about whether two people who'd spent an evening learning how far they'd go to protect each other were ready to build something stronger than either of them had imagined possible. The question now wasn't whether they'd survived the night. It was whether they'd learned enough about trust and deception and love to ensure they'd never have to survive anything like it again. The real FBI field office was a stark contrast to the elaborate surveillance operation Margaret had been trapped in for hours. Agent Sarah Chun, the actual lead investigator on the Morrison case, sat across from Margaret in a sterile conference room, laying out the scope of what they'd uncovered with methodical precision. Mrs. Morrison, the operation you helped expose tonight reaches further than we initially suspected, Agent Chun said, spreading documents across the table. We've identified criminal activity in 7 states, involving over $300 million in laundered money. Margaret studied the charts and financial records, seeing the name Morrison appearing repeatedly throughout the documentation. How much of this involves my family directly? More than you might expect, less than it could have been. Agent Chin pulled out a specific file. Mrs. Morrison, your husband's cooperation over the past 6 months prevented this organization from expanding into several new areas. But your brother David and your sister Louise have been essential to their operations for over 2 years. The words hit Margaret like a weight she'd been carrying without knowing it. Essential how? David Morrison provided legal services that legitimized criminal enterprises. Louise Morrison provided financial intelligence that allowed criminals to avoid detection. Together, they created a network that was nearly impossible to penetrate. Margaret felt the familiar urge to protect her family's reputation, to minimize their involvement, to find explanations that would preserve some vestige of the relationships she'd built her life around. But looking at the evidence, she realized that protecting Louise and David meant enabling them to destroy other families. Agent Chin, what happens to them? That depends partially on you. Margaret felt her stomach clench. What do you mean? Agent Chen leaned forward, her expression serious. Mrs. Morrison, your testimony could be essential to prosecuting this case. But pursuing maximum charges against your family members would require you to testify to conversations and observations that would likely result in life sentences for both David and Louise. The choice was clear and devastating. Complete justice would destroy what remained of her family. Partial justice would leave criminals free to harm other people. What are my options? You could provide limited testimony that focuses on the impersonation and kidnapping you experienced tonight. That would ensure the immediate threats to your family are neutralized while allowing your brother and sister to face reduced charges for their cooperation in the investigation. Margaret thought about Louise's frantic phone calls, her desperate attempts to locate Margaret when she realized how much danger she was in. She thought about David, who'd apparently spent the evening coordinating with real federal agents to ensure James and Emma's safety. Agent Chen, are you saying Louise and David were trying to protect me while also participating in criminal activity? We're saying the situation is more complex than initial evidence suggested. Agent Chen pulled out another file. Mrs. Morrison, did you know that your sister Louise has been feeding information to the FBI for 8 months? The revelation hit Margaret like lightning. Louise was working with you? Louise Morrison became a confidential informant after she discovered the scope of David's involvement with money laundering operations. She's been trying to protect you while gathering evidence against the larger criminal network. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet once again. And David? David Morrison has been cooperating with federal authorities for 6 weeks. Ever since Louise convinced him that his legal clients were planning to eliminate witnesses who could implicate them in serious crimes. The complexity of what Margaret was learning made her head spin. You're telling me that Louise and David have been working with the FBI while pretending to work with criminals? We're telling you that your family has been in an impossible situation for months, trying to protect each other while exposing a criminal organization that had them all under surveillance. Margaret realized that every betrayal she discovered tonight had been accompanied by an act of protection she hadn't recognized. Louise's manipulation had been cover for evidence gathering. David's criminal associations had been necessary for intelligence collection. Even Richard's secrecy had been designed to shield her from a truth that could have gotten her killed. Agent Chen, if I provide full testimony, if I help you prosecute this case completely, what happens to my family? Your testimony would ensure that a criminal organization responsible for trafficking drugs, laundering money, and murdering witnesses faces justice. But it would also likely result in prison sentences for family members who were trying to protect you. And if I provide limited testimony? The immediate threats to your family are eliminated, but several higher-level criminals might escape prosecution. Future families might face the same dangers yours has faced. Margaret felt the weight of impossible mathematics settling on her shoulders. Save her family at the cost of other families' safety. Ensure complete justice at the cost of destroying the people she loved most. Agent Chen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Of course, if Louise and David have been cooperating with you for months, if they've been gathering evidence and feeding you information, why do they need to face serious charges at all? Agent Chen was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Morrison, your brother and sister participated in criminal activity for over 2 years before they began cooperating. During that time, their actions enabled drug trafficking, money laundering, and financial fraud that harmed hundreds of families. But they eventually chose to fight back. They chose to fight back when the criminal organization threatened your family specifically. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to understand, David and Louise's cooperation with us was motivated by protecting you, not by concern for the broader community. The distinction hit Margaret with crystalline clarity. Her family hadn't been motivated by justice, they'd been motivated by love for her. Which meant that other families hadn't received the same protection, the same consideration, the same desperate efforts to ensure their safety. How many other families were destroyed while my family was being protected? Agent Chen consulted her files. Based on our investigation, at least 12 families lost their homes, their savings, or their lives to this criminal organization while your brother and sister were facilitating their operations. Margaret felt sick with the implications. 12 families. 12 families that we know of. The actual number is likely higher. Margaret thought about her grandchild, about the world Emma's baby would grow up in, about the choices that would shape that child's understanding of right and wrong. Agent Chen, if I provide complete testimony, if I ensure that everyone involved faces full prosecution, what guarantee do I have that this actually stops the criminal organization? No guarantee. Criminal organizations adapt, evolve, find new partners. But Mrs. Morrison, complete prosecution sends a message that this kind of operation has consequences. It provides justice for the families who've been harmed. And it ensures that your family members face the same accountability as any other criminals. Margaret realized that the choice she was facing wasn't just about family loyalty versus justice. It was about what kind of person she wanted to be, what kind of legacy she wanted to leave, what kind of world she wanted her grandchild to inherit. I need to speak with Richard, Margaret said. And James. And Louise and David. Before I make this decision, I need to understand what each of them is willing to sacrifice for justice. Mrs. Morrison, that's highly irregular. Agent Chen, you're asking me to make a choice that will determine whether my family stays together or falls apart completely. You're asking me to weigh their freedom against other families' safety. I think I have the right to discuss this with the people who'll be affected by my decision. Agent Chen was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Morrison, what if your family members ask you to choose their protection over complete justice? Margaret thought about the woman she'd been at the beginning of the evening. The woman who managed crises instead of solving them, who protected appearances instead of pursuing truth. Then I'll have to decide whether I love them enough to save them from the consequences of their choices, or whether I love them enough to ensure they face those consequences. The distinction felt important, fundamental. Margaret realized that the most loving thing she could do might also be the most devastating thing she could do. Agent Chen arranged the meeting. All of them. Richard, James, Louise, David. I want everyone who's been affected by this situation to understand exactly what we're choosing between. And then, Margaret stood up, feeling something settle in her bones that felt like certainty. And then I'm going to make the choice that lets me look my grandchild in the eye someday and explain why their family either stayed together or fell apart. But as Agent Chen began coordinating the family meeting that would determine everyone's future, Margaret realized that there was still one more revelation waiting. One that would test everything she thought she'd learned about love, loyalty, and the price of doing what's right. Because sometimes the most impossible choice wasn't between family and justice. Sometimes it was between the family you'd built and the family you needed to become. The question now was whether Margaret Morrison had the courage to choose growth over comfort, truth over loyalty, and the future over the past. Even if it meant losing everything she'd spent 28 years building. Even if it meant accepting that love sometimes required letting go. Even if it meant admitting that the strongest families were the ones brave enough to hold each other accountable. The meeting that would determine their future was about to begin. And Margaret Morrison was about to discover whether she was strong enough to save her family by refusing to save them from themselves. The FBI conference room felt too small to contain 5 people whose lives had been irrevocably changed in a single evening. Margaret sat at the head of the table, looking at faces she'd known for decades but was seeing clearly for the first time. Richard, her husband of 28 years, bore the exhaustion of a man who'd spent months living double lives to protect his family. James and Emma, her son and daughter-in-law, held hands with the fierce protectiveness of new parents facing an uncertain future. Louise, her sister, carried the weight of 18 months spent walking the razor's edge between protection and betrayal. And David, her brother, looked like a man who discovered that good intentions could still lead to devastating consequences. I've asked Agent Chen to give us 30 minutes, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. 30 minutes to decide whether this family prioritizes loyalty or justice, protection or accountability. Mom, James began, but Margaret held up her hand. Before anyone speaks, I need you all to understand what we're choosing between. Margaret spread Agent Chen's documents across the table. Complete testimony from me means Louise and David face potential life sentences for their participation in money laundering and racketeering. Limited testimony means several criminals escape prosecution and other families remain at risk. The weight of the choice settled over the room like a shroud. Margaret watched her family process the implications. That saving each other might cost other people their safety, that doing the right thing might destroy everything they'd built together. Margaret, David said quietly, there's something you need to know before you make this decision. What? David pulled out a folder he'd been holding since entering the room. Louise and I didn't ask for this meeting to convince you to protect us. We asked for it to tell you that we've already made our choice. Margaret felt her heart begin to race. What choice? Louise leaned forward, her expression calm despite the tears in her eyes. Margaret, David and I are going to testify. Full cooperation, complete disclosure, maximum accountability for our actions. The words hit Margaret like lightning. What are you saying? We're saying that 18 months ago, we made choices that enabled criminals to hurt innocent families, David explained. We made those choices for complicated reasons, fear, money, misguided loyalty, but we made them. And now we're choosing to face the consequences. Margaret stared at her brother and sister, seeing something in their expressions that she'd never seen before. Not the desperate protectiveness that had driven so many of their recent decisions, but a kind of peaceful resolution. You're going to prison, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. We're going to take responsibility, Louise corrected. Margaret, for 18 months we've been trying to find ways to protect our family without facing what we've done. It took tonight, it took seeing how our choices put you and James and Emma in danger, to realize that real protection means accountability. Richard was staring at David and Louise with something approaching awe. You're choosing justice over family. We're choosing justice for family, David said firmly. Richard, do you want James and Emma to raise their child knowing that their grandparents and aunt and uncle escaped consequences for enabling criminals? Do you want that baby to grow up believing that family loyalty means protecting each other from the truth? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt tears starting, but they weren't tears of grief, they were tears of recognition. This was what courage looked like. This was what love looked like when it chose growth over comfort. There's more, Louise said quietly. Margaret, the testimony David and I are going to provide, it's not just about our own crimes. We have evidence that will expose criminal operations in 12 other cities. Evidence that could protect hundreds of families from what ours has been through. Agent Chun, who'd been listening from the corner of the room, stepped forward. Mrs. Morrison, your brother and sister are offering to provide testimony that could dismantle one of the largest money laundering networks in the country. Their cooperation would go far beyond anything we initially expected. Margaret looked around the table at her family, seeing them clearly for the first time in years. How long have you been planning this? Since the moment Louise realized you were in danger tonight, David admitted. Margaret, we spent 18 months trying to protect you from the truth. But when we saw what that protection had cost, not just you, but other families, innocent people who suffered while we tried to manage the situation, we knew we had to choose differently. Emma spoke for the first time since entering the room. Mrs. Morrison, James and I have been talking. We want you to know that we support whatever choice you make. But we also want you to know that we're proud of Louise and David for choosing accountability. Proud? Margaret asked. Proud that our child will grow up in a family that chooses truth over convenience, James said. Mom, for my entire life, I've watched you manage crises, smooth over problems, protect everyone from consequences. Tonight, I'm watching you and Louise and David choose to solve problems instead of managing them. The observation hit Margaret with unexpected force. She realized that her son was seeing something she hadn't recognized, that her lifelong pattern of protection and management had sometimes enabled problems instead of solving them. James, are you saying I should have pushed for truth earlier? I'm saying that tonight you're showing me what it looks like when love chooses courage over comfort. And Mom, I want my child to learn that from you. Margaret felt something fundamental shifting in her understanding of family, of love, of what it meant to protect the people you cared about most. Richard, what do you think? Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces around the table. Margaret, 6 months ago when I started cooperating with the FBI, I thought I was protecting our family by keeping secrets. Tonight I'm learning that real protection means trusting your family with the truth. He reached across the table to take her hand. I think Louise and David are showing us what courage looks like. And I think we should follow their example. Margaret felt the weight of 28 years of marriage, of protecting and managing and controlling, lifting from her shoulders. Agent Chun, if I provide complete testimony, if our entire family cooperates fully with your investigation, what happens then? Then you help us dismantle a criminal network that's been destroying families for years. You ensure that Louise and David face appropriate consequences for their actions, while also ensuring they're credited for their cooperation. And you give your grandchild a family that chose justice over convenience. Margaret looked around the table one more time, seeing faces that reflected determination, acceptance, and something that looked like peace. There's one more thing, she said quietly. Something I need you all to understand before we do this. What? Louise asked. I'm proud of you. All of you. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. Richard, I'm proud that you chose to fight criminals instead of enabling them, even when it meant lying to me. Louise and David, I'm proud that you chose accountability over escape, even when it means facing prison. James and Emma, I'm proud that you're choosing to build a family that values truth over comfort. Margaret stood up, feeling decades of fear and control and protection falling away. Agent Chen, we're ready to provide complete testimony. All of us. Whatever the consequences, whatever the cost, we're going to ensure that this criminal organization can't hurt any more families. But as Agent Chen began coordinating the testimony that would reshape all their lives, Louise held up her hand. There's one more thing, Louise said, her expression shifting to something Margaret couldn't identify. Something that changes everything about what we think we're choosing. Margaret felt familiar dread settle in her stomach. What now? Louise pulled out a document Margaret hadn't seen before. Margaret, the criminal organization we're helping to expose, it's not the only one. Agent Chen, show her the Federal Task Force report. Agent Chen hesitated, then produced a thick file. Mrs. Morrison, what your family has helped us uncover is part of a larger investigation spanning 15 states and involving hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal activity. What does that mean? It means that your family's testimony isn't just about one case. You're going to be witnesses in a federal prosecution that could change how money laundering operations function across the entire country. Margaret felt the scope of what they were committing to expand beyond anything she'd imagined. How many people are we talking about? Over 300 individuals, including government officials, financial institution executives, and criminal organization leaders, Agent Chen said. Mrs. Morrison, your family's choice tonight isn't just about accountability. It's about transforming how these crimes are prosecuted nationally. The revelation hit Margaret like sunlight after a storm. They weren't just choosing between family loyalty and individual justice. They were choosing between protection and transformation, between managing their own crisis and solving a problem that affected thousands of families. Louise, Margaret said, understanding flooding through her. You've known about this from the beginning. I've known that our choices tonight would matter beyond our family, Louise confirmed. Margaret, we're not just choosing accountability for ourselves. We're choosing to be part of something that protects families we'll never meet, children who haven't been born yet, communities that don't know they're at risk. Margaret looked around the table at her family, seeing them not as people she needed to protect, but as partners in something larger than any of them had imagined. Agent Chen, she said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised everyone, including herself. When do we start? Agent Chen smiled for the first time all evening. Mrs. Morrison, we start now. And when we're finished, there's going to be a very different conversation about what family means when it chooses courage over comfort. As federal prosecutors filed into the conference room and recording equipment was set up for testimony that would reshape criminal prosecution across multiple states, Margaret Morrison realized that the evening had taught her something profound about love. Real love didn't protect people from consequences. It helped them become strong enough to face consequences and grow from them. Real family didn't manage crises. It solved problems that affected more than just themselves. And real courage wasn't about making the safe choice. It was about making the choice that created a better world for the people you'd never meet but loved anyway. The testimony was about to begin. The transformation was already complete. 18 months later, Margaret stood in the courthouse steps, watching David and Louise emerge from their sentencing, hearing with the dignity of people who'd chosen accountability over escape. The morning sun caught the silver in Louise's hair. A year and a half of stress had aged her sister, but it had also revealed a strength Margaret had never fully recognized. For years, Louise said simply, referring to her sentence. David got 6 because his involvement was deeper. Margaret felt the familiar urge to offer comfort, to minimize the consequences, to find ways to make the situation easier. Instead, she pulled Louise into a fierce hug that communicated everything words couldn't: pride, love, respect, and the deep peace that came from choosing truth over convenience. I'm proud of you, Margaret said, and meant it completely. The federal prosecutions that had grown from their family's testimony had been everything Agent Chen had promised and more. Over 400 individuals prosecuted across 15 states. Nearly $1 billion in criminal assets recovered and returned to victims. Entire criminal networks dismantled, their operations scattered to the winds. But the personal costs had been significant too. How's Richard handling the business restructuring? David asked as they walked toward the parking garage where Margaret's car waited. Better than expected. Turns out that rebuilding a company's reputation is easier when you're actually innocent of the crimes you were accused of. Margaret smiled, thinking of her husband's determination to transform Morrison and Associates into something that actively fought financial crime instead of unknowingly enabling it. The consulting contracts with federal agencies are keeping us busier than ever. Louise stopped walking, studying Margaret's face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to recognize transformation. Margaret, you look different. Happy but different. Margaret considered the observation. 18 months of testifying in federal trials, rebuilding her marriage on complete honesty, and learning to trust her own strength had changed her in ways she was still discovering. I think I stopped managing my life and started living it, Margaret said. Turns out those are very different things. They'd reached Margaret's car, but none of them seemed ready to say goodbye. These courthouse visits had become a monthly ritual, Louise and David reporting for their legal obligations, while Margaret provided family support and updates on the life continuing around their consequences. How's James handling fatherhood? David asked. Margaret's smile was radiant. Like he was born for it. Baby Sarah, yes, we named her after the real Agent Chun, is 6 months old and has her father completely wrapped around her tiny finger. The naming choice had been Emma's idea, a way of honoring the woman whose investigation had ultimately saved their family from a criminal conspiracy they'd never fully understood. Agent Chun had cried when they'd asked permission to use her name. And Emma? Thriving. She started law school, wants to specialize in financial crimes prosecution, says she wants to help other families avoid what we went through. Margaret felt pride swell in her chest. She's using her own experience as case study material for her classes. Louise and David exchanged a look that held 18 months of shared consequences and growing peace. Margaret, Louise said carefully, we need to tell you something. About our appeal. Margaret felt familiar anxiety spike. What about it? We're dropping it, David said simply. Our lawyers think they could get our sentences reduced, possibly significantly. But Louise and I have decided we're going to serve our full time. The decision hit Margaret with unexpected force. Why? Because the victims of the crimes we enabled deserve to see full accountability, Louise explained. Because our grandniece deserves to grow up in a family that chooses justice over convenience, even when it costs us personally. Margaret felt tears threaten, not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. This was what love looked like when it chose growth over comfort, when it prioritized the future over the past. There's something else, David added. The Victim Restitution Fund we helped establish. It's grown beyond anything anyone expected. Margaret, the testimony you provided, the evidence our family helped gather, it's resulted in recoveries that are changing lives across the country. Margaret thought about the letters she'd been receiving, from families whose savings had been recovered, from communities whose development funds had been restored, from children who could now attend college because stolen education money had been returned to their parents. How many families? She asked. Over 800 so far, Louise said. Margaret, your choice to pursue complete truth instead of family protection. It's given 800 families their lives back. The number hit Margaret like sunlight. 800 families. 800 sets of parents who could sleep at night knowing their children's futures were secure. 800 communities that could trust their institutions again. Mrs. Morrison? Margaret turned to see a young woman approaching with obvious nervousness. Yes, I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. I know you don't usually give interviews, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to comment on the anniversary of the Morrison trials. Margaret looked at Louise and David, seeing encouragement in their expressions. For 18 months, she'd avoided media attention, preferring to let the legal proceedings speak for themselves. But something about this moment felt different. What would you like to know? People are calling what your family did unprecedented, choosing to testify against each other for the greater good. Some critics say you destroyed your family for abstract principles. How do you respond to that? Margaret considered the question, thinking about the family dinner they'd shared last week, Richard, James, Emma, baby Sarah, and video calls with Louise and David from their respective facilities. Thinking about the laughter, the honest conversations, the deep peace that came from relationships built on truth instead of secrets. I'd say those critics misunderstand what family actually means, Margaret replied. We didn't destroy our family, we saved it. We chose to become people our children and grandchildren could be proud of, instead of people they'd have to make excuses for. But your sister and brother are in prison. Your husband's business was nearly destroyed. You spent months in witness protection. How is that saving your family? Margaret smiled, thinking of baby Sarah's laugh, of Emma's determination to fight financial crime, of Richard's passion for his new consulting work, of Louise and David's letters describing the educational programs they were leading in their facilities. Because when my granddaughter is old enough to ask about her family's history, I can tell her that when we discovered we were connected to criminal activity, we chose to stop it instead of hiding from it. When she asks about her great-aunt and great-uncle, I can tell her they chose accountability over escape. When she asks about her grandmother and grandfather, I can tell her we chose truth over comfort. Margaret paused, thinking about the woman she'd been 18 months ago, focused on appearances, on managing problems instead of solving them, on protecting family reputation instead of building family character. Our family is stronger now than it's ever been, Margaret continued. Not because we avoided consequences, but because we faced them together. Not because we protected each other from the truth, but because we trusted each other with it. The reporter was scribbling notes rapidly. What would you say to other families facing similar situations? I'd say that the most loving thing you can do for people you care about is help them become the best versions of themselves, even when that means letting them face consequences for their choices. I'd say that real protection isn't about avoiding problems. It's about building the strength to solve them. Margaret looked at Louise and David, seeing pride and love and the deep satisfaction that came from choices made with courage instead of fear. And I'd say that family loyalty isn't about protecting each other from accountability. It's about supporting each other through the process of becoming people worthy of that loyalty. As the reporter finished her interview and walked away, Margaret found herself standing with her brother and sister in the afternoon sunshine, feeling the weight of 18 months of transformation. Any regrets? Louise asked softly. Margaret thought about the question seriously. The sleepless nights during the trials, the months of witness protection, the stress of rebuilding Richard's business and reputation, the pain of watching Louise and David face prison sentences. None, she said firmly. Not a single one. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Asterisk Sarah's first word was Dada. Emma's taking pictures. James is crying. Come home when you can. Your family misses you. Asterisk. Margaret showed the text to Louise and David, watching their faces light up with vicarious joy. Go, David said gently. Go home to that beautiful family you helped save. As Margaret drove away from the courthouse, she thought about the evening 18 months ago when her husband had announced his affair at their son's wedding. She thought about the woman she'd been then, comfortable in her assumptions, blind to the dangers surrounding her family, focused on appearances instead of truth. That woman had been destroyed completely in a single evening. The woman driving home now was someone entirely different. Stronger, braver, more honest, and infinitely more capable of protecting the people she loved because she'd learned the difference between protection and enabling. Margaret's phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. Louise's name appeared on the screen. Did you forget something? Margaret asked. Just wanted to say thank you, Louise said, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret, 18 months ago you could have chosen to protect David and me from consequences. You could have chosen family loyalty over justice. And instead you chose to love us enough to let us become better people. You chose to trust us to be strong enough to face what we'd done and grow from it. Margaret felt tears starting again. Louise, you and David chose that. I just supported your choice. You made that choice possible by refusing to protect us from ourselves. As Margaret ended the call and walked toward her front door, she could hear baby Sarah's delighted squeals from inside the house, could see Richard and James through the window taking turns making silly faces to entertain their daughter and granddaughter. This was what victory looked like. Not the absence of consequences, but the presence of people who'd chosen to grow through consequences instead of avoiding them. This was what family looked like when it chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, transformation over protection. Margaret opened her front door and stepped into the sound of laughter and love and the deep peace that came from knowing that every person in this house had chosen to become worthy of the trust they placed in each other. Baby Sarah looked up from her father's arms and smiled, not just with her mouth, but with eyes that would grow up seeing honesty as normal, accountability as loving, and courage as the foundation of real family. Margaret Morrison had spent 28 years building a family based on managing problems. Now she was part of a family based on solving them. The difference, she realized, was everything. "Welcome home," Richard said, wrapping his free arm around her while James and Emma crowded close with the baby. "I am home," Margaret replied, meaning it in ways she'd never understood before. This was home, not a place or a house or even a group of people, but a commitment to growth, to truth, to becoming better versions of themselves for each other and for the world around them. This was family, not perfect people protecting each other from consequences, but courageous people supporting each other through the process of becoming worthy of love. And this was love, not comfortable or safe or convenient, but transformative and demanding and strong enough to choose what was right over what was easy. Margaret Morrison had learned that the most devastating revelation wasn't discovering that your life was built on lies. It was discovering that you were strong enough to build something better on truth. What did this story teach you about the courage it takes to choose accountability over protection, and the possibility that real love sometimes means letting the people we care about face the consequences that help them grow? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.